So in the Capstone Workshop course, we have a strict policy to undertake projects only for governments and not-for-profit organizations. And there are two important reasons for that. One is that we don't believe that students should pay tuition to do work for private firms who would benefit from their work. The other reason is that we view the Capstone Workshop as a public service to clients who couldn't otherwise afford this kind of sustainability consulting assistance. The next project is about a very hot topic. It seems like I see billboards and commercials about plant-based burgers all the time, and this is a variation on this trend. Please welcome Eugene to the podium, who will talk to us about this topic. Eugene.
Thank you, George. Thank you for your attention. As George mentioned, our project was on sustainable solutions to feed the world. My name is Eugene Krishnan, and I'm representing my team who is on the screen here. So we'll move forward. Our client was the New York Seascape program, which is a part of the larger global organization, the Wildlife Conservation Society. The mission of the New York Seascape program is to protect and restore a healthy wildlife population to the marine waters around the metropolitan New York area, and also to inspire an ocean conservation ethic for our community, which is important when thinking about the significance of this project for our client. That ocean conservation, particularly the concepts of overfishing and pollution, our client had a very forward view on the potential positive benefits of faux seafood, actually, as that becomes more mainstream, and thought it would be interesting to look at both seaweed and plant-based meats, which are alternatives to seafood and meat that have already made it mainstream, and they wanted to better understand some of the implications of those products. Which brings us to our project scope. We were tasked with looking at the alternatives to meat and seafood, specifically sea greens, cell-based meats, and plant-based meats. We were asked to identify the life cycle impacts within the realm of health, social, economic, and the bundle for environment of climate, land, and ocean impacts. We were asked to look at the product messaging for these different categories, and then to provide recommendations on whether New York Seascape should be supporting these products in terms of integrating them into their facilities for sale and also as part of their educational programming. So let's talk about what these things are. First, sea greens, more commonly known as seaweed. This slide is just to show you there's lots of them, but there's actually only 10 that are intensely cultivated. The majority of that historically has been on the coast of Asia. When we think about the US, you'll more commonly know this in Asian cuisine for wrapping sushi or within Asian soups. In the last 10 years, you may have seen it in Costco in this form shown on the slide as dried seaweed snacks. And we're starting to see in the same channel these faux seaweed products, but the seafood products, that actually seaweed is one of the core ingredients. But that is not part of the scope of our project because it's still small in the market. Cell-based meats are grown in a lab. It's basically taking stem cells from animals, feeding it with nutrient-rich serum, which turns them into muscle cells and fiber, and finally into meat. The patents for cell-based meats were filed about 20 years ago. Amazingly, it's still in experimental form. We talked from the companies we spoke to, they're still 2 or 3 years away from commercialization. That brings us to the plant-based meats that George talked about being on those billboards, such as Impossible and Beyond. The scope of our project within plant-based meats was really to focus on this next generation product, which has done a much better job of mimicking the taste and texture of a real beef burger, because it's created a real breakthrough from a commercial perspective in terms of actual consumption of these products versus the frozen products that were in stores historically. When we think about our deliverables, there's 2 sets. For our secondary research, we did an extensive literature review of a number of different sources, academic, government, media, and organized it within a searchable database. We also did primary research. A list of key players and products came out of that, as well as documented interviews and site visits. All of this went into our analysis, which led to our recommendations to our client around support and messaging. Let's talk a little bit about our methods. For our literature review, we compiled and organized over 300 citations and summarized within these 6 topics. For our interviews, we did over 15 interviews from a diverse set of folks, including scientists, producers, and commercial players. This includes Professor Alexander Hristov, shown here, who was helpful in updating us on the progress in using seaweed within cattle feed to reduce methane emissions of cattle by 80%. And John Lemon at the bottom, who is the executive chef at Bear Burger, who updated us on their success in taking vegetables, primarily veggie burgers, from 15% to close to 50% of their sales over the last 3 years. In terms of our marketing assessment, this was done by actually visiting the stores and looking at the product labeling. We also visited the actual facilities where the client is located, and you can see from the pictures here, we were very committed to the process, and we did tastings as well. In terms of our synthesis, we used the 4 life cycle impacts that the client identified for us: environment, health, economic, and social policy, to help us organize the vast volumes of quantitative and qualitative data. Within that, we tried to identify core attributes, as you can see here, for health, to help us assess whether each of these life cycle impacts was supportive of the product for the client. To illustrate how this works, you can see here for sea greens and the environment, we identified, or we're illustrating 4 attributes that we looked at, and for each we either chose to support it, or we used the research to evaluate whether it was supported, whether it required further investigation, or whether the research did not support the claims. So for example, with climate change resilience, there was some academic research out of Australia where they modeled out the future for seaweeds and came up with the conclusion that by the year 2100, 80% of seaweed species could be extinct under a very conservative climate temperature rise scenario. So given that seaweed is moving poleward, if it's an issue in Australia, it's an issue globally, and we decided that climate change resilience was not supportive of the environmental theme. So now if we look at the holistic results, you can see here, if we roll up that process, sea greens and plant-based meats generally had positive results, and cell-based was more mixed. We'll go into that in more detail. Within sea greens, the only real challenge here was the social and policy component, where the food safety regulations, if you can believe that or not, within the US are not clearly defined, and they're working on that. And then if you think about developing markets, the wages for the folks actually collecting the seaweed is below the poverty line. So those are issues that need to be addressed. For cell-based meat, as we mentioned, it's very experimental, and frankly, the academic studies had very contradictory conclusions. So that made it very difficult to assess the health, economic, and social components in a positive way. For the environment, we gave it a positive primarily because of a unique characteristic, because it's grown in a lab. For the more extreme climate scenarios that it looks like we're heading towards, it's the one solution that actually addresses that. For plant-based meats, We think this is the solution that has the most commercial scale potential in the US, given the maturity of its economic and social model in particular. From a health perspective, we just think it would be helpful to do more studies to assess the process nature of the product. So in terms of our recommendations, both for support and messaging, for Sea Greens, we would recommend that they support the product. In terms of the messaging, we do believe that it can be messaged as a healthy, highly functional superfood, as it's called, because some of the different species are known for having more calcium than milk, more soy than protein, and generally they have the most iodine that can be found in nature. From an ocean perspective, seaweed absorbs, an individual seaweed plant can absorb 5 times as much carbon dioxide as a land-based plant on average, and as an ecosystem, 20 times. So it's very helpful in terms of ocean acidification. In terms of the challenges, it's more of an ingredient and not a main meal, so it's got consumption limitations, and as we mentioned, there's some climate vulnerability. For cell-based meats, we would recommend that they do not support cell-based meats at this time, but they continue to monitor it, given the unique environmental characteristics and the rapid change in the technology. For plant-based meats, we would also recommend that they support this set of products, and in their messaging, they can highlight the environmental impact of moving from consuming beef to consuming plant-based meats. There's a University of Michigan study that shows a 90% reduction in carbon and water footprint and close to a 50% reduction in energy. It's interesting, as you see here, Burger King, a lot of the success has been in more fast food, mass consumer channels, which is a good learning point and a unique characteristic that might be leveraged as they start thinking about faux seafoods and how that might save marine life more directly. And lastly, as we mentioned, the nutrition risk of a processed food, that could be important both for plant-based meats and seafoods when they get there. So how will the client use the deliverables? We believe they can both advocate their support for several of these products and educate the public on their attributes in the messaging that we mentioned. And here are pictures of some of the places where they can do that in terms of their facilities. They have restaurants, the educational program on site, and their outreach programs. In terms of for future research, clearly plant-based seafood is a next step, and they've already talked about using our deliverables to set the foundation for working with a consultant to work on the faux seafood area. The technology uncertainty within not just cell-based meats, but within seaweed, commercial scaling of that production is still in question, and as we mentioned, the processed nature of some of these foods. And that's it, so any questions?
Okay, questions for Eugene. We'll start here.
Hi, Eugene. Great presentation. I've seen some news reports about the cell-based meats. Is there right now currently a scalability issue with those types, or not really?
I would say there's all sorts of issues, frankly, at this moment. That's why there's no commercial products. The companies that we spoke to said it's a few years away. If you look at the studies, there's energy intensity issues potentially. They don't actually know how it's going to size up on a health basis either.
Question there.
Great job, Eugene. So it seems, from your presentation, it seems like your research seems to favor plant-based meats, and you mentioned that it uses soy. So my question actually has two parts. The first one is, I'm assuming the soy is traditional industrialized agriculture. So the first question is that the case? And the second question is, did you consider the effect that all the fertilizer runoff would have in nitrogenation of the oceans, apoxic zones, toxic algae blooms, further killing sea life in the oceans?
Thanks for the question. So a couple of answers. So the plant-based meats actually The two main products, Beyond is made out of primarily pea protein, and they do not, or it's minimal soy, and Impossible Burger is soy-based. But the other larger consumer packaged good companies are bringing out other products with a similar sort of focus on taste and texture, which may not use soy. So that's something to take into consideration. In terms of the factors like fertilizer runoff, I mean, frankly, that's one of the upsides of studying seaweed. It's being used not just for food, but it's used for environmental remediation, so you can do both. In fact, in Long Island, that's how they're using it, and it makes the seaweed grow faster. So they're actually complementary solutions.
Okay, one last question from Naomi there in the back.
In your presentation, you mentioned something about seaweed not being environmentally resilient or some type of resiliency with seaweed, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I would say, I think my teammates would tell you I'm obsessed with seaweed at this point. I think it's one of the most amazing things on the planet, both from a consumption standpoint and some of the potential of what it could do for the climate. But the climate resilience is a real issue, meaning a number of the species are sensitive to temperature, particularly the ones that we consume. And there's already been a number of studies that show, you can see on the map, that the species are moving towards the North Pole and the South Pole. So as the temperature increases, you have to come up with a number of solutions which they're working on. So one of the solutions is, instead of growing it on the coasts, they're looking at, can you grow it in the deep sea? But right now it's not economically feasible. And of course, you know, technology, everyone thinks about genetically modifying these things, but that has all sorts of potential ethical considerations to take into consideration.
Very nice, Eugene. Thank you.